Mother. She had a different name. No one has known it for around 70,000 years. She had one, for she lived among talkative and highly social people. Mother, for reasons that will become obvious, will do. She was probably young, tough, stocky, and dark-skinned. She was a traveller, part of a people always on the move. She was also heavily pregnant. Her tribe's people were hunters and expert gleaners of berries, shellfish, roots, and herbs. They carried tools and hides, and a couple of babies with them, tied with sinews and skins around adult backs, but there were surprisingly few children in the group. Those who didn't learn early to walk, keep quiet, and keep up tended to die, picked off by predators following the group. In their own way, the travellers were, however formidable, armed with spears and razor-sharp chipped stone cutting edges that had been developed over around 100,000 years of hunting, and, if they were anything like later hunter-gatherers, while fighting rival tribes. Their average age was relatively young, something that would remain true of all human societies until very recent history. But there would have been people in their 50s or 60s. It is now thought that the female menopause may have been a useful evolutionary adaptation to provide grandmothers, who could care for the young while younger women were breeding. Tribes with grandmothers would be able to support more children to adulthood, and therefore would grow at the expense of tribes without older women. The men would have been marked by hunting scars, but would be vocal and thoughtful tacticians, experienced in tracking game and exploiting their understanding of other animals. The oldest, the father of this clan, might be in his 60s. Hunters in their 30s or 40s may have been the most effective food gatherers. This group had been moving for years, slowly north, through what are now called Kenya and Somalia, towards a strip of water that looked possible to cross. The flow of water was lower than it used to be, leaving dry patches of land. Wading between them would have been a risk worth taking, because the game and the vegetation around them was getting harder to find. Life would be easier on the other side. The group would have had no idea they were about to leave one continent where all humans originated, nor any notion of just how far their descendants would walk, working their way along beaches, a mile or two every year, clearing out the shellfish and the crabs in rock pools, gorging on a beached whale, spearing ridiculously incurious goats. All life was a journey. Always a new track must be made. Ahead of them and behind them, once they had moved on, the easier prey would return, but to stay put in a single place would be unnatural and dangerous. Declare anywhere home, and you would die of hunger. So, though the water was a challenge, and everyone was watching everyone else as they waded, for the group had a language and talked about their plans, this was just another day. They were probably clothed in some way. A study of body lice DNA suggests that they were infesting clothing around 100,000 years ago, and it is thought humans lost most of their own fur millions of years ago. This group, much larger than a single family, would be accustomed to sharing out tasks, and this was directly related to the problems that started again with mother's labour pains. Like all women, she knew the birth would be painful. Ever since anyone could recall, human babies had been born with surprisingly large heads, so big that to force them out through the vagina was agonizing. Mother would give birth standing up, surrounded by her sisters. Her baby would be helpless, a wobbling, vulnerable thing for far longer than the children of other animals. It was a puzzle, about which many things would be said during the long nights of storytelling. But the vulnerability of the modern human child was a long-term strength, because it forced families and tribal groups to share out work and to cooperate. Today's hunter-gatherer societies generally have a clear division of labour between male hunters and females gathering plants, and it is likely this was already happening by Mother's time. It would be many tens of thousands of years before people realised that the big head, the relative helplessness, and the consequently painful birth added up to an evolutionary triumph, producing animals able to tell stories. Historians of human evolution also suspect that our warlike, xenophobic, and mutually hostile character likewise evolved in Africa, and for the same reasons. Tribes extending beyond family groups are at an advantage if everyone works together for the good of the tribe, even if what they do is dangerous or unpleasant for them at the time. This means that tribal bonding is very important. Without a sense of belonging and mutual dependence, the tribe falls apart. The other side of this is that in a world where human tribes are moving around, searching for game, the tribal bonding is likely to be reinforced by hostility to other tribes. This obviously continues to matter. Everywhere on the planet, early human societies seem to have worked hard to differentiate themselves from their neighbours, wearing different headdresses, jewellery, clothing, and above all, speaking different languages. The British zoologist Mark points out that even today, after so much cultural homogenisation, there are 7,000 different languages spoken by humans, almost all of which are mutually unintelligible. Why? Other animals are not like this? He argues that our good qualities, our capacity to be kind, generous, and friendly, allowing us to evolve cooperative and bigger groups, to get along with each other, have to be set against bad qualities. Our tendencies to form competing societies, often not far from conflict. In hunter-gathering groups competing for land, conflict is common, and tribal war often a fact of life. We have been hunter-gatherers, we humans, for far, far longer than we have been farmers, at least 10 to 15 times as long. We are only now becoming a species that mainly lives in cities. But if we say we have been dominated by cities for a century or two, then our hunter-gathering trail is 1,000 times longer. So it would be literally unnatural if much of our behaviour did not relate in some way to that inheritance. Above all in our combination of sociability and mutual suspicion. And so, back to Mother. For she was the mother of almost all of us. There is another earlier, even mistier figure, mitochondrial Eve, who would be the mother of everyone, Africans included, far earlier in the human story, perhaps some 200,000 years ago. But her story is less well understood. Our character's maternal achievement is to be understood literally rather than as a parable. There are arguments about this, as there are about every aspect of early society, but the balance of probabilities is that she is your supermother. If you are a New York lawyer, she is where you came from. If you are an Aboriginal Pacific Islander in a cancer hospital, or a German farmer, or a Japanese office cleaner, or a Pakistani Londoner at university, you come from our Eve. Stephen Oppenheimer of Oxford University, a specialist in DNA studies, says every non-African in Australia, America, Siberia, Iceland, Europe, China, and India can trace their genetic inheritance back to just one line coming out of Africa. That is, one group. One journey. This seems now to be the consensus view. At first sight, it also seems impossible. How can one woman, giving birth to one child, be the mother of most of the human race? The answer goes by the name of matrilineal drift, and works like this. In each generation, some families do not reproduce successfully. It may be because of disease, a hunting accident, incompatibility, but some maternal lines die out. Over very long periods of time, therefore, almost all do. They have gone, and gone forever. Imagine the process as a huge scythe sweeping backwards through thousands of generations, gathering up a dark harvest of never-made-its. As the Darwinian writer Richard Dawkins reminds us, we are the children of survivors. The seeming paradox is that alongside this scythe there is an ever-widening delta of humans being born and actually surviving. Why? Because for those who do survive long enough to procreate, if they can have child survivors at just a little above the 2-for-2 natural replacement rate, and the same applies to those child survivors in turn, mathematics decrees a surprisingly fast upwards line of population growth, all of which must therefore be children of the earliest survivors. There were patrilineal ancestors too, of course. It is just that nobody has yet found a DNA trace that helps us pursue them this far back. Though hard to grasp, and feeling like an optical illusion in heredity, drift makes better sense when we recall that this is a period when the overall human population is barely increasing, and when life expectancy is very short. Eve is our universal mother because tigers, snakes, landslides, and microbes got the others. Eve's tribal group was already a remarkable achievement in survival against the odds. Part of a human population of several hundreds of thousands in Africa, which had emerged in competition with other varieties of clever ape. Human history, properly understood, starts when we move from being just another form of prey in the cycle of eat and be eaten, a creature blown about by the natural world, to a creature beginning to shape the world. We move from happens to makes happen. But Homo sapiens was only one branch of a tree of hominids who were learning how to alter their environment, if only in a minor way. There are almost no historical arguments as complex and heated as those about modern man's origins. The reason is straightforward. Scientific advances in the study of human DNA and in the dating of bone fragments and other material keep challenging and sometimes overturning earlier theories. It may be the furthest back part of human history, but it is changing faster than the history of, say, the Second World War. Amateurs must step delicately across an exciting minefield. One thing that is now widely agreed, however, is that this is a story in which climate plays a pivotal role, more so than we used to realize. The cooling and warming of the planet, because of solar activity, meteorite strikes, eruptions, or tiny changes in its angle of spin, affect the advance and retreat of deserts, the opening or closure of bridges for migration, and thus the story of our storytelling ape. In general, the more complicated the changes in the climate, even when they produce the extinction of other animals, the faster the advance of hominids seems to have been. Adversity favours the versatile. The first attempts by tree-living African hominids to live on 2 feet came after cold, dry weather attacked their forests 2 million years ago. The open grasslands that resulted made it imperative to be able to run and hunt and see into the distance, and scientists believe this eventually resulted in Homo erectus, an important early version of humanity, with a brain around 2/3 the size of ours. There were further changes in brains as the warm Pliocene epoch gave way to the ice ages of the Pleistocene, and to new challenges. Inside Africa, it now seems a great complexity of hominids evolved. But Homo erectus, which ranged far out of Africa, evolved first into the bigger-brained Homo heidelbergensis, people who were hunting and making axes in England 500,000 years ago, and had a brain not so much smaller than ours, around 1,200 grams, compared with our 1,500. Modern us-sized brains had evolved in Africa around 150 to 100,000 years ago. This gives modern humans the largest brain for body size of any known animal, about 7 times bigger than you might expect for our heft. This picture of human development is a brutal simplification. There are intimidating-sounding lists of pre-modern human species, varying greatly in height, shape of skull, leg bones, and weight. Though scientists name and slot them into seemingly neat divisions as evolutionary trees are assembled, the truth must have been messier. Chris Stringer of London's Natural History Museum usefully reminds us that species are, after all, humanly created approximations of reality in the natural world. Skulls of similar age, which are alike but not identical, hide subtler variations between early humans lost to us, so we should not get too scared by the thicket of scientific names. What most needs to be grasped is that modern humans were not just a single, super-bright, planet-conquering ape who leapt as if by magic from an earlier world belonging to dim ape-men. Those earlier species, including the famous Neanderthals, and in Asia the Denisovans, both coming after Homo heidelbergensis, also survived dramatic changes in climate and pushed into new territories as pioneers, equipped with cutting and killing tools. They probably decorated themselves, may have had some form of language, and may even at the edges have interbred with the newcomers, Homo sapiens. More interesting to us, though, is what they lacked. So let us now return to Mother and her tribal migration. Did it really happen that way? Everyone agrees that Africa retains a genetic diversity of humans not found anywhere else, and that all humans began there at some point. But there has been a major argument about whether all non-African modern humans originated in a single, or nearly single, movement out of the continent, spreading round the world from around 70,000 years ago. The alternative idea is that these other species, which had left Africa and colonized Europe and Asia much earlier, in fact survived. Could they have evolved into, and in places also bred with, Homo sapiens? Between the two extremes, there are shades of grey, but these offer two radically different views of today's humanity. One says that, in essence, all non-Africans are close relatives, mothers' children. The other argues that different human populations emerged more slowly and separately in different parts of the world. This, it is claimed, may explain why many of us look and even behave so differently. The latter view has been more popular among academics outside the Western tradition, and our ideas about contemporary humanity barely need spelling out. This is not a dry argument. Are we family or rivals? Scientific opinion is now heavily tilted to the out of Africa or recent African origin model, mainly because of advances in tracing one particular form of DNA marker, mitochondrial DNA, leading back to Africa, where modern humanity, Homo sapiens, did not begin to appear until about 200,000 years ago. But the old picture of apes simply getting cleverer and cleverer until our lot walked out of Africa and began populating an empty Europe and the Middle East seems to be wrong. Just like other animals, earlier hominids had been on the march long before. Recent archaeological discoveries in South Africa suggest that fire and cooking were being used nearly 2 million years ago by Homo erectus, though this is a highly controversial issue. It would help explain the growth in brain size, since cooking greatly increases the quantity of calories that can be ingested, and brains are very energy-hungry. At any rate, before our migration, the world was already inhabited by other kinds of people. What happened to them? It is likely that they were victims of changing climate conditions, destroyed by cold and hunger when temperatures fell again, or possibly by modern humans who were better organized and able to adapt. Nor, it seems, did modern humans leave Africa through Egypt, breaking first into the Mediterranean and European worlds, as Europeans once thought. We first went south, heading down along the coast of India and Southeast Asia, foraging for shellfish as we went, and eventually, somehow, made it to Australia across the sea. Again, scientists argue about this, but it seems possible that Aboriginal Australians arrived in their land many thousands of years before Aboriginal French or Spanish got to theirs. And tracing back through the DNA trail suggests that the Cro-Magnon Europeans were descended from people who, before turning north, lived in today's India. History is the story of migration as much as settlement, long before Columbus or the Irish arrived in America. What caused the Homo sapiens push out of Africa? Again, there are rival theories. Around 73,500 years ago, a massive volcano erupted in what is today called Sumatra. This was by far the biggest such disaster of the past 2 million years, and some scientists suggest that modern humans nearly did not make it through at all when the eruption misted the skies and radically cooled the planet. Some argue that the human population fell back to only a few thousand individuals in southern Africa, causing a bottleneck in evolution for thousands of years. This may have produced a radical pruning back and regrowth of a more ruthless and organized humanity, better able to migrate round the world when conditions improved. Mother's well-organized tribe. Others think this has been exaggerated, and that bad though the conditions were, many species survived them. Once that human migration from Africa had happened, however, it is clear that further episodes of chilling and heating shaped their later movements and ultimate success. It took a long time for the routes to open up across today's Middle East and into Europe. But once humans arrived there, a later volcanic eruption in Italy, some 39,000 years ago, and sporadic Heinrich events, when icebergs broke off into the Atlantic, producing severe periods of cooling, kept the climate unpredictable. The northern ice cover retreated and then came back again several times. The migration patterns of deer, bison, and other animals shifted. Comfortable refuges became grim, and then grim wastelands bloomed. Repeatedly, humans had to alter their habits and behavior to survive. Again, adversity favors the versatile. It seems that after the African migration, small numbers of Homo sapiens were better adapted to manage these shifts in climate than earlier versions of human had been. If so, this happened not because of classic Darwinian evolution, there wasn't time, but because of the accelerated development caused by culture, language, learning, copying, remembering. We became more skilled with our fingers. In bigger groups we were able to allow specialization, the best trackers to track, rope weavers to weave, arrowhead makers to chip. Working together, we were better, more lethal hunters. Human groups struggling to cope with a cold, drier world had to learn new things, including the ability to make more complex language, empathize with prey, about which more soon, and both fight with and learn from rival groups. Chris Stringer says that this allowed the acceleration that replaced the 2 million years of boredom. Through imitation and peer group feedback, populations could adapt well beyond the abilities of an isolated genius, whose ideas might never get beyond his or her cave, or might be lost through a sudden death. It may very well be that other Homo groups were also able to speak, plan ahead, and so on, but not so well, and were therefore destroyed by the rate of change in the world around them, or were wiped out, and possibly eaten, by us. Another historian of early people, Brian Fagan, has argued that this new cooperation involved the invention not simply of speech, but of abstract thought. A new realm of symbolic meanings, which thrived in a world of partnerships between humans and their surroundings, and which included for the first time art and, perhaps, religion. Carrying all this with us, we spread first into Asia and then Europe. We reached the far east of Asia around 40,000 years ago and arrived in the Americas across the Beringia land bridge, long gone, around 20,000 years ago. By 12,000 years ago, we had reached the southern areas of South America, and the final areas of human habitation were the islands of the mid-Pacific. Hawaii and New Zealand were reached only 1,000 years ago by people whose culture was still essentially that of the Stone Age, yet who had developed impressive star navigation and boat building. This spread of Homo sapiens is very fast compared with the 1.4 million years or so for the development of our previous ancestor, Homo erectus, into us. In biological time, it is like an explosion. Everywhere we arrived, there is evidence of the extinction of other large mammals. We should rid ourselves of any comfortable or complacent sense that contemporary humans, sitting in coffee bars or driving cars, are superior in intellect to the hunter-gatherers who emerged from those hard African eons. Hunter-gatherers had to be able to do many more different things than today's urban people, and it has been estimated that men have lost around 1/10 of their brain size compared with the people of the last ice age, and women 14%. The Australian scientist Tim Flannery points out that the same is true of domesticated animals compared with their wild forebears, and for the same reasons. Overall, life for all members of our domesticated mixed-feeding flock is made so much more accommodating that its members can invest less of their energy in brains. If you doubt how far our civilization has turned us into helpless, self-domesticated livestock, just look at the world around you. This may seem harsh, but it is a useful corrective to our modern condescension. Early humans, driving out of Africa, were extraordinary, rather terrifying creatures.